The key turned with a clean click. I stepped inside and felt the stillness breathe around me. Unfurnished walls, scuffed hardwood floors, and sunlight stretching long across the hallway. It smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner. Not luxury, not permanence, but it was mine. I had signed the lease 3 days ago, paid the deposit in full, and hauled everything I owned in 2 carloads, a futon, a small dining table, 4 mismatched plates, and a thrifted lamp with a crooked shade. No one helped me move. I hadn't asked. I was setting down a box of utensils when I heard the engines. 2 vehicles pulled up. First, my dad's Navy SUV. Then Emma's minivan sagging slightly under the weight of car seats and plastic bags. Doors opened like an unfolding threat. My father first arms crossed Emma behind him, wrangling her twins, and Ryan shuffling out last with a diaper bag. No one had texted. No one had called, but they were here on my sidewalk like this was a planned delivery. I didn't open the door right away. When I finally did, my dad didn't say hello. He looked behind me, past me into the apartment like appraising a hotel suite. His brow creased. "Where are we supposed to sleep?" Emma hovered behind him, biting her lip. One of the kids asked if there was a bunk bed. I kept my hand on the knob. "You're not." He squinted. "What, you're not sleeping here?" I said clearly. "This place isn't for you." My dad's expression didn't change. It hardened. "You're saying we came all this way for nothing? I didn't ask you to come." Emma stepped forward, voice brittle. "The kids were so excited, Lila. They picked out spots for their sleeping bags." "I understand," I said. "But this is my apartment. It's not a family space. It never was." There was a pause, long, heavy, the kind that used to scare me into backing down. But not this time. I stood in that doorway, feet planted. And then, without raising my voice, I added, "You don't live here. You don't sleep here. You don't decide this time." I closed the door, not with force, but finality. For the first time in years, I exhaled without guilt. I used to think it was normal to pack up your things every time company came. In our old house in Boise, my room doubled as a guest space storage overflow, or on some weekends, a quiet room for Emma's babies to nap. I learned early how to make myself small, how to roll up my mattress pad and tuck it behind the laundry shelf without making noise. I slept on the living room carpet more times than I can count. My dad said it built character. My mom said I was the easy one. Emma was never asked to move. She was younger by 3 years, but you wouldn't have known it by the way our parents orbited her. Every need was urgent. Every setback was a crisis. If she cried, the whole house hushed. If I succeeded, the house kept chewing. I remember once 7th grade, I won 2nd place in the regional science fair. I came home carrying a certificate and a $75 bookstore gift card. My dad barely looked up from his football game. Emma had a sore throat that day, and the mood in the house was delicate. Later that night, I overheard Mom whispering Emma's just more sensitive. Lila doesn't need all that fuss, so I stopped expecting the fuss. I learned to celebrate alone quietly in the back row with a kind of dignity no one else seemed to recognize. I worked through high school bagging groceries after class not because I had to, but because I wanted to save for college. I opened a separate account at a credit union and labeled it Own Fund for University of Colorado. Every time I skipped a coffee or took an extra shift, I imagined my future in a city where no one would ask me to give up my bed. When the acceptance letter came, I held it in shaking hands. Interior design, full admission. I told Mom, who was stirring something on the stove, and she said, "Oh, that's cute. But Emma's going through a tough time right now. Can you help her find a daycare this weekend?" I nodded. Of course. 2 months before my move, I called the bank to confirm my account balance. The woman on the line cleared her throat awkwardly and said, "It was withdrawn last week. All of it. Signed by a joint account holder, Linda Harper." The air went out of me. When I asked my mother, she sounded annoyed. Emma's lease fell through. She and the baby had nowhere to go. "You're still going to school, aren't you?" I was. But I took out a loan with interest that same week and never mentioned it again. In their eyes, I had a future. Emma had emergencies, and I was the bridge between them. Always bending, always giving until one day I didn't. College didn't break me, but it tried. I learned how to make one pack of ramen last 2 meals, sometimes 3 if I skipped the flavor packet and added hot sauce from the campus cafe. I worked mornings at the library, stamping return dates and fixing the broken spine of donated books. At night, I packed floral centerpieces at a shop 2 bus routes away. By the time I crawled into bed, it wasn't sleep I craved. It was stillness, the kind where no one asked me for anything. My professor said I was precise, disciplined, and natural. I said thank you and smiled, then ran spreadsheets until midnight trying to stretch $32 across 5 days. Emma, meanwhile, was back in Boise, posting pictures of latte art and baby milestones. She dropped out of her nursing program midway through her 2nd year. Too much stress, she said, but still managed to land a part-time admin job at a clinic through one of Dad's old contacts. For her 24th birthday, my parents surprised her with a used Honda Civic. "It's time she had some independence," Mom said. I got the news via group text. The same week, I walked 4 miles in the rain to avoid another overdraft fee on my transit card. I didn't complain, not out loud. I told myself it was fine temporary character building. But then came the message that knocked something loose. I had just submitted my final project for Studio Design 3. It was 2 in the morning, and I was sitting on the back stairwell outside my apartment, cooling off from a panic attack I hadn't named yet. My phone buzzed. "Mom, we covered Emma's daycare this month. Use that savings account you never touch. Figured you wouldn't mind." There was no question, no heads up, just assumption. My emergency fund built from canceled haircuts, skipped lunches, and missed outings gone. Just like that. I stared at the message until my vision blurred. No tears, just a slow, suffocating pressure down on my chest like a weight I wasn't allowed to acknowledge. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Instead, I curled up on the stairwell with my knees pulled to my chest and let the quiet swallow me. They didn't hate me. That was the hardest part. They loved me, I think, in the way people love tools. Useful, durable, built to carry weight, and I had carried it. For years, I convinced myself it was noble that I was the strong one. That maybe love looked different when it was quiet, when it didn't come with praise or protection. But in that stairwell beneath the buzzing hallway light, I finally let myself wonder, what if it was never love at all? That night, I started looking for internships in other cities. I toured 23 units before I said yes. Some were too dim, too cold, too much carpet. Others came with peeling cabinets or landlords who smiled too quickly. But then I stepped into the 1-bedroom on Maple Avenue, a 2nd-floor walk-up with sunlight pooling on the floor like it had been waiting for me. It smelled faintly of citrus and old paint. The windows opened easily. There was a heater that ticked when it warmed up and a creaky floorboard just past the kitchen archway. It wasn't beautiful, but it felt honest. I didn't need a dream home. I needed enough space to exhale. The lease was straightforward. I read every line twice signed in blue ink and transferred the deposit from my home fund spreadsheet with a steady hand. When the keys dropped into my palm, it felt like being handed permission. I moved in slowly. No trucks, no help. Just a rolling suitcase and 2 borrowed plastic bins. I brought in my books first, then my plants, then a folding chair. I placed everything with intention, even the silence. For 2 weeks, I told no one. I walked to work, brewed coffee in the mornings, watched light shift across the walls in the evening. I wasn't hiding. It just hadn't occurred to me that I needed to explain. Then one Saturday, I sent a text to the family group chat. "Saturday at 3, come see my place." The response was immediate. "Emma, are we bringing an air mattress or are there enough beds?" "Mom, how exciting. We'll grab lunch on the way." The kids are thrilled. "Dad, send the lease papers. I want to take a look before we move forward." I stared at the screen. I hadn't said we. I hadn't offered anything beyond a glimpse, but their assumptions slid in easily like a hand into an old glove. Of course I'd made space for them. Of course they'd already packed. I closed my phone and placed it upside down on the counter. That evening, I opened every window and let the air in until the whole apartment smelled like rosemary, and something sharp, something clean. I stood in the center of the room, barefoot, listening to the walls breathe. If I'd said nothing, they might have stayed away. If I'd said more, they might have asked permission. But silence, I was learning, didn't protect you. Sometimes it just gave other people more room to assume you'd never say no. I poured a glass of water, sat in my folding chair, and waited for the knock I already knew was coming. They arrived at 2:04 in the afternoon, just late enough to feel intentional. Dad walked in first without knocking, brushing past me like he was inspecting a property he'd already closed on. Emma followed, balancing a diaper bag and a tote filled with coloring books. Ryan lingered outside, and the kids poured in like it was their new playground, jumping from one corner of the living room to the other, yelling about who got the window side. I said nothing. Just moved to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and waited. Emma set a manila folder on the table. "We wanted to show you this in person," she said. Her voice was light practiced. "It'll make more sense once you see it." Dad opened the folder with a tap of his knuckle like it was a poker hand he knew would win. Inside, mortgage documents, property listings, a color printout of a large house with a wraparound porch and 5 bedrooms. One of the pages had notes scribbled on it. Emma and Ryan master suite. Kids upstairs. Lila office. Our guest room. "This is the one," Dad said. "Green Valley new development just minutes from Emma's work in a great school district." "I didn't agree to this," I said quietly. He looked up, eyes sharp. "You didn't say no. I didn't say yes either." Emma leaned in. "We already put down $2,000 to hold it through Mom's account. The bank just needs a primary borrower. Your credit's the cleanest." I stared at her. "So you planned a family mortgage using my name? I'll contribute what I can." She offered too quickly. "Maybe $3,400 a month. Once Ryan picks up more shifts." Dad crossed his arms. "You live alone. No dependents. This is a chance to build something together." I didn't raise my voice. "I've been building something alone." He slammed his hand on the table. "Where are we supposed to sleep?" Then I stood up. "You don't. Not here." The room stilled. Even the children quieted. I gathered the folder, closed it, and placed it back in front of them. "If you want the house, buy it yourselves. But not with my name." Emma's face crumpled. Dad turned red. Ryan finally stepped inside but said nothing. I didn't explain. I didn't apologize. Instead, I walked to the door, opened it, and waited. One by one, they filed out. No one said goodbye. The first message came at 1:13 in the morning. "Emma, you didn't have to embarrass us like that." The kids didn't understand. I didn't respond. By morning, another followed. "Dad, you're not family anymore. Don't come crawling back when you realize what you've done." That one made me pause, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. I looked at the words for a long time, waiting for the familiar ache, the panic. Nothing came. Later that afternoon, my phone lit up with a call from Mom. I let it ring out the first time. She tried again 10 minutes later, then again. On the 4th, I answered. Her voice was trembling the way it always did when she was just upset enough to seem fragile, but not enough to be kind. "Lila, your sister's devastated. Your father's blood pressure is up. Do you know what this is doing to our family?" I sat on the floor beside my bookshelf, her voice tinny in my ear. "You're tearing us apart over a few pieces of paper. You could have just signed and figured the rest out later." "We always figure it out." "Not this time," I said. My voice was steady. "Calm," she sniffled. "I don't know what happened to you. You used to be so thoughtful." "I'm still thoughtful," I said. "Just not for people who only think of me when they need something." She went quiet. Then the line disconnected. I put the phone face down, stood up, and walked to the hardware store. $38 later, I returned with a new deadbolt and installed it myself. That night, I ordered Mexican takeout carne asada tacos and horchata and ate it sitting cross-legged on my living room floor. I didn't scroll. I didn't reply. Instead, I watched the streetlights blink on outside and felt the weight in my chest shift. Not vanish, just rearrange itself into something manageable, familiar. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't vindicated. But for the first time after one of their storms, I wasn't crumbling. I was intact. And I wasn't going anywhere. It had been nearly 4 months since the folder hit my table, and they walked out without looking back. I hadn't blocked anyone. I just stopped reaching out. Then one evening, just as the light was dipping past the window ledge, my phone buzzed. Emma, I get it now. I'm sorry. No preamble, no questions, just that. A second later, another message arrived. A photo of Ethan and Ava sitting cross-legged on a blanket paper crowns on their heads, the baby asleep in Emma's lap. The room around them was cramped and dim, but there was warmth in it. Bare walls, mismatched mugs, a single bulb casting soft light. Real unstaged. We're in a rental for now, she wrote. It's small but peaceful. I stared at the photo longer than I expected to, not because of the kids, but because of her. There was something in her face, exhaustion. Yes, but also a kind of clarity, like she'd stopped performing. 2 days later, she stood at my front door with a backpack, a car seat, and a quiet smile. She didn't bring an apology wrapped in ribbon. She didn't expect a tour. She just asked if we could sit. We talked on the porch while the kids chased shadows in the yard. Nothing deep, just how hard it is to buy groceries with rising prices, how daycare waitlists are a joke. She told me she was doing virtual admin work now. I nodded, handed her a glass of water. She didn't fill the silence, and I didn't force it. We weren't rivals anymore. Just two women who had carried too much for too long. She didn't ask me to forget anything. I didn't need her to bleed. When Mrs. Carter from downstairs brought up a tin of cookies, she handed it to me, glanced at Emma through the screen door, and said, "You look lighter with them here." After dinner, the kids fell asleep in a pile of blankets in the corner of the living room. Emma sat beside me with a mug of tea. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The next morning, they were still there. I repainted the living room a soft gray, the kind that shifts with the light. I did it slowly over a weekend, one wall at a time, a podcast humming in the background. When it dried, I stood back and felt something settle, a quiet that didn't need to be earned. The mint on the windowsill had finally taken. I clipped a few sprigs and tucked them into a jar by the sink. Every time I passed, the scent reminded me I had planted something and it hadn't died. My mom came by once in early spring. She stood at the door with a store-bought coffee cake and eyes that didn't carry fire or frost. "I'm not here to fix anything," she said. "I just thought you might let me sit for a while." I did. She complimented the curtains, asked about work. She didn't mention Emma didn't bring up the house. When she left, she didn't say you should visit. She said, "I'm trying," and I believed her. A week later, I hosted dinner on the patio. Emma brought chicken and a bottle of ginger ale. The kids drew chalk rainbows on the concrete. Mrs. Carter arrived with pickled green beans and her usual commentary on city construction. I invited Mia, a coworker who once gave me a ride home in the rain and never asked why I was crying in the passenger seat. We ate off mismatched plates. Someone spilled juice. Laughter rose, not loud, but easy. When the sun dipped, I passed around folded blankets. I didn't hover. I didn't explain anything. I just let it be. That night, as I rinsed dishes and heard Ethan giggling from the next room, I caught myself saying it aloud for the first time. I'm glad they're here. I'm glad they're home. And I meant it. Not because they needed me. Not because I was making space, but because I hadn't needed to shrink to let them in. Lila learns to prioritize her own boundaries and self-worth after years of sacrificing her space and resources for her family's demands. By refusing to let her sister's family move into her new apartment and rejecting their attempt to use her credit for a house, she reclaims her autonomy. The experience teaches her that love doesn't require self-erasure, and that setting firm limits, even at the cost of family tension, is essential for her peace. This lesson allows Lila to build a life where she can welcome others without shrinking herself, finding a balance between independence and connection.
The grandfather clock in Uncle Richard's dining room had just chimed 7 when he stood up, wine glass in hand, and cleared his throat. The entire Morrison family turned to face him, 15 adults and 8 children gathered around the massive mahogany table that had hosted Christmas dinner for 3 generations. Before we continue with dessert, Uncle Richard announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built Morrison Construction from a 2-man crew into the city's largest commercial builder, I need to address some family business. I set down my fork, the bite of Mom's apple pie turning to ash in my mouth. At 28, I'd learned to recognize that tone, the same one Uncle Richard used when he was about to fire someone or terminate a contract. As you all know, he continued, gesturing around the table, Morrison Construction has been the foundation of our family's success for 40 years. It's provided good jobs for our men, funded our children's educations, and built the legacy we're all proud of. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. My cousins Michael and David nodded approvingly from their seats near the head of the table, both of them having been handed vice president positions straight out of college despite never having swung a hammer or read a blueprint. However, Uncle Richard's voice grew stern. Some family members have chosen to pursue other interests instead of contributing to our shared success. Every eye in the room turned to me. I sat perfectly still in my simple black dress, the same outfit I'd worn to every family gathering for the past 3 years. While my female cousins wore designer clothes and expensive jewelry, I'd learned that understated appearance served my purposes better. Sarah, Uncle Richard said, looking directly at me, you've made it clear that you think you're too good for honest construction work. You've refused every opportunity I've offered you, preferring to waste your time with computers and consulting. The way he said consulting made it sound like a dirty word. Around the table, aunts and uncles shook their heads disapprovingly. Only my parents looked uncomfortable, though they remained silent. Therefore, Uncle Richard announced, effective immediately, you are cut off from any future involvement in Morrison Construction. No job offers, no financial support, no expectation of inheritance. You've chosen your path. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of children playing in the living room. I felt 15 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for my reaction. I understand, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. Good, Uncle Richard said, sitting back down. Maybe now you'll realize that family businesses require family commitment. Just as Aunt Margaret began passing around coffee cups, the doorbell rang. Uncle Richard frowned. Christmas dinner was family only and everyone was already here. I'll get it, my cousin Michael said, pushing back from the table. Through the archway we could hear the front door opening and Michael's surprised voice. Mr. Patterson, I didn't know you were coming tonight. Sorry to interrupt Christmas dinner, came a familiar voice that made my pulse quicken, but I was in the neighborhood visiting my own family, and I wanted to drop off these contracts for Richard to review. Uncle Richard stood up quickly, smoothing his shirt. James, come in. You're always welcome here. James Patterson entered the dining room and I had to suppress a smile. At 55, he was one of the most powerful commercial developers in the region, and Morrison Construction's biggest client. His company, Patterson Development, had provided nearly 40% of Morrison's revenue over the past 3 years. Sorry to interrupt your family gathering, James said, his eyes scanning the table until they landed on me. His face lit up with genuine pleasure. Sarah, I didn't expect to see you here. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Uncle Richard's smile faltered as James walked directly toward my chair. It's good to see you, Mr. Patterson, I said, standing to shake his hand. Please, we've been through this. Call me James. He turned to address the entire table, his voice warm with admiration. I hope you all realize how lucky you are to have Sarah in your family. Uncle Richard's face had gone pale. I'm sorry, James, but I think there might be some confusion. Confusion? James looked genuinely puzzled. About what? She does some computer consulting work, Uncle Richard said weakly. James laughed heartily. Computer consulting? Richard, Sarah is the CEO of Nexus Solutions. She's revolutionized project management software for the construction industry. Her company is worth over $2 billion. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my cousin David's fork hit his plate. That's impossible, Michael said, his voice strangled. Sarah doesn't, she can't. Can't what? James asked, his tone suddenly cooler. Can't build one of the most successful tech companies in the country? Because she absolutely has. I remained standing, feeling eerily calm as my family's worldview crumbled around them. For 3 years I'd sat at this same table while they treated me like the family disappointment. The niece who'd rejected honest work for frivolous pursuits. The young woman who drove a 10-year-old car and lived in a modest apartment while her cousins flaunted their inherited wealth. James, Uncle Richard said, his voice shaking slightly, surely you're thinking of someone else. I'm thinking of the woman who created the software that's increased Morrison Construction's efficiency by 30% over the past 2 years, James said firmly. The CEO who's been personally overseeing the technology integration for your biggest projects. Aunt Margaret dropped her coffee cup. The crash of china on hardwood seemed unnaturally loud. You mean? My cousin David started, then stopped, his mouth hanging open. I mean, James continued, that Sarah's company has been the silent partner behind Morrison Construction's recent success. The project management software, the automated scheduling systems, the client relationship databases, all Nexus Solutions products. He pulled out his phone and showed the screen to Uncle Richard. In fact, I was just reviewing the quarterly reports. Morrison Construction's productivity gains from Nexus software have saved your company approximately $1.2 million this year alone. Uncle Richard stared at the phone like it might bite him. But more importantly, James continued, Sarah has been personally consulting on our joint projects. The Riverside Complex, the Downtown Convention Center, the Medical District expansion. Sarah's been the project coordinator behind the scenes for all of them. That's not possible, my cousin Michael protested. We handled those projects. David and I were the lead coordinators. James's expression grew cold. Actually, you weren't. When Morrison Construction started missing deadlines and going over budget on our projects 2 years ago, I insisted on bringing in external project management. Sarah's team has been running coordination for every major project since then. The room was spinning. I could see my family members exchanging horrified glances as they began to understand the implications. The reason Morrison Construction has been so successful lately, James continued relentlessly, is because Sarah has been fixing the problems created by inexperienced management. But she never said anything, my mother whispered. Because I asked her not to, James replied. Sarah suggested that having a family member openly critiquing Morrison's operations might create tension. She preferred to work behind the scenes to ensure both companies' success. Uncle Richard finally found his voice. Sarah, is this true? I looked around the table at my family, the same people who'd spent years dismissing my work, questioning my choices, and treating me like a charity case they were obligated to tolerate. Yes, I said simply. You own a billion-dollar company? Aunt Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. $2 billion, I corrected. As of last quarter's valuation. Uncle Richard sank back into his chair. Why didn't you tell us? Because you never asked, I said. Every family gathering you talked about Morrison Construction's success, about the big contracts and impressive profits. But you never asked about my work beyond dismissing it as computer stuff. But you drive that old car, my cousin David said weakly. Because it's reliable and paid for, I replied. I prefer to invest in assets that appreciate rather than depreciating luxury items. James looked around the table with obvious disappointment. I have to say, I'm surprised by your family's reaction. Sarah is one of the most respected entrepreneurs in the region. Her company has been featured in Forbes, Tech Weekly, and Business Journal. She's won 3 industry innovation awards this year alone. We didn't know, my mother said, tears in her eyes. Because you didn't want to know, I said gently. When I tried to explain my work, you changed the subject. When I mentioned successful projects, you assumed I was exaggerating. You saw what you expected to see, the unmarried niece without an obvious career path. Uncle Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Sarah, I need to apologize. I had no idea. You had no idea because you never looked beyond your assumptions, I interrupted. For 3 years, I've been quietly ensuring Morrison Construction's success while you credited it to superior family management. James checked his watch. I should let you all get back to your dinner. Sarah, I'll email you those contract revisions tomorrow. Actually, I said, I think we need to discuss the Henderson project timeline. Of course. Should I call your office Monday? That won't be necessary. I opened my purse and pulled out a business card, placing it on the table in front of Uncle Richard. I think it's time for more transparent communication between our companies. Uncle Richard picked up the card with shaking hands. The thick, expensive cardstock read, Sarah Morrison, CEO, Nexus Solutions, with my direct phone number and email address. This is really your company? He whispered. One of them, I said. Nexus Solutions is my primary business, but I also own Morrison Tech Consulting and Riverside Properties. Morrison Tech Consulting? My cousin Michael asked. That's the company that's been handling our IT upgrades. And Riverside Properties owns the office building where Morrison Construction leases space, I added quietly. The silence stretched on until James cleared his throat. Well, this has been enlightening. Sarah, I'll speak with you soon about expanding our partnership. After James left, the family sat in stunned silence. The children's laughter from the living room seemed to come from another world. Sarah, Uncle Richard finally said, I don't understand. If you own these companies, why didn't you just tell us? I sat back down, suddenly feeling exhausted. Because I wanted to see if my family could respect me for who I am, not what I own. But we always respected you, Aunt Margaret protested weakly. No, you tolerated me, I corrected. There's a difference. You saw an unmarried woman approaching 30 with no obvious career success, and you felt sorry for me. You offered me entry-level positions at Morrison Construction like you were doing charity work. My cousin David leaned forward. Sarah, we had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing if you'd bothered to ask real questions instead of making assumptions, I said. When I mentioned working on large-scale project management, you assumed I meant small business consulting. When I talked about software development, you assumed I meant basic computer repair. Uncle Richard rubbed his forehead. What can we do to make this right? I looked around the table at my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. These weren't bad people, but they were small-minded people. They'd built their entire identity around a construction company that, without my intervention, would have failed 2 years ago. You can start by acknowledging that success comes in many forms, I said. You can stop assuming that because someone doesn't follow your prescribed path, they're automatically failing. We can do that, my mother said quickly. And you can stop offering me entry-level positions at Morrison Construction like you're doing me a favor, I continued. If you want to discuss business partnerships between our companies, we can do that as equals. Uncle Richard nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. Sarah, I want you to know that you'll always have a place in the family business. I smiled sadly. Uncle Richard, I already have a place in the family business. I've been keeping it profitable for 2 years. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members asking increasingly detailed questions about my companies and accomplishments. It was surreal watching them try to reconcile their assumptions with reality. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their children to leave, Uncle Richard approached me privately. Sarah, I owe you more than an apology, he said. I owe you my business. Without your help. Without my help, Morrison Construction would have lost the Patterson account and probably folded within 18 months, I finished. But that's not why I helped. Why did you? Because you're family, I said simply. Even when you didn't treat me like family, you're still my uncle. I wasn't going to let the family business fail just to prove a point. Uncle Richard's eyes filled with tears. What happens now? I considered the question carefully. Now we move forward with honest communication. Morrison Construction can continue using Nexus Solutions software and consulting services, but as a paying client, not as a favor to family. And the family relationship? That depends on whether you can see me as Sarah the CEO instead of Sarah the disappointing niece. 6 months later, I sat in the boardroom of Morrison Construction, reviewing quarterly reports with Uncle Richard and my cousins. The family business was thriving under a new partnership structure that acknowledged my company's contributions while maintaining Morrison's independence. These efficiency numbers are incredible, my cousin Michael said, studying the latest productivity reports. We're operating at levels I never thought possible. That's what happens when you implement proper project management systems, I replied. Technology amplifies good management and exposes bad management. Uncle Richard looked up from his reports. Sarah, I need to ask you something. What? That night at Christmas dinner when I cut you off from the family business, did you know James was coming? I smiled. James always visits his parents on Christmas. They live 3 blocks away. And yes, I knew he'd probably stop by to drop off those contracts. So you planned it? I plan to let you make your announcement without interference, I said. What happened after that was just timing. My cousin David laughed. You let us hang ourselves. I let you reveal who you really were, I corrected. Just like I revealed who I really was. Uncle Richard shook his head in amazement. You know what the strangest part is? What? You were never the family disappointment. We were disappointing you. As I drove home that evening in my reliable 10-year-old car, I reflected on the journey from that Christmas dinner to this boardroom meeting. My family had needed time to adjust their perspective, to see beyond their assumptions and acknowledge reality. Some relationships were worth rebuilding even when it meant starting from scratch. Even when it meant proving yourself to people who should have believed in you from the beginning. But the most important lesson I'd learned wasn't about family dynamics or business success. It was about patience. The patience to let people reveal themselves completely before deciding whether they deserved a place in your future. Uncle Richard and my cousins had chosen to grow and adapt. They'd acknowledged their mistakes and worked to build genuine relationships based on mutual respect. And sometimes that was enough. Some people might call it deception. I called it strategy. The next morning, I woke up in my modest apartment, made coffee in my simple kitchen, and prepared for another week of running my hospitality empire from behind the scenes. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Thank you for the most perfect day of my life. I love you. I smiled and got back to work. Because this was who I was. Emma Thompson, the quiet sister who drove an old Honda and lived below her means. Who also happened to own a $2.8 billion empire and had just thrown the wedding of the year. Some secrets were worth keeping. The rain drummed against the windows of Morrison & Associates as we gathered for the reading of Dad's will. I sat in the back corner watching my brothers Marcus and David adjust their expensive suits and whisper calculations under their breath. They'd been doing math all week. Dividing Dad's $2 million estate between themselves while assuming I'd get some token inheritance, maybe enough for a down payment on a modest house. If they only knew. Before we begin, announced Harold Morrison, Dad's longtime attorney, I need to address some unusual circumstances regarding Mr. Thompson's estate. Marcus straightened up, his wedding ring catching the light. At 35, he was the eldest and had always acted like Dad's heir apparent. He owned a successful accounting firm and lived in a McMansion with his wife Jennifer and their twin boys. Unusual how? David asked, leaning forward. At 32 he was the middle child and had followed Dad into real estate development. His company, Thompson Development Group, had been struggling lately, and I knew he was counting on this inheritance to keep it afloat. I remained silent in my simple black dress, the same one I'd worn to Dad's funeral 3 days earlier. While my brothers had delivered eloquent eulogies about Dad's business legacy and their plans to honor his memory, I had simply stood by his casket, holding Mom's hand as she wept. The unusual circumstances, Mr. Morrison continued, opening a thick folder, involve the actual ownership of Mr. Thompson's assets. What do you mean, actual ownership? Marcus demanded. Dad owned Thompson Industries, the family home, the lake house, and his investment portfolio. We've seen the documentation. Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses. That's where things become complicated. 3 years ago, your father entered into a series of transactions that fundamentally changed the ownership structure of his assets. David frowned. What kind of transactions? Sales, Mr. Morrison said simply. Your father sold everything. The room went silent except for the rain and the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. That's impossible, Marcus said, his voice rising. We would have known. I handle his books. Actually, Mr. Morrison said, the sales were conducted through a third-party holding company. All transactions were legal and properly documented, but structured in a way that allowed your father to retain operational control during his lifetime. I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same feeling I got during board meetings when competitors thought they had me cornered. 3 years ago, when Dad first got his cancer diagnosis, he'd called me into his study for a conversation that changed everything. Emma, he'd said, I need to tell you something about your brothers. Dad had discovered that Marcus had been embezzling from Thompson Industries for 2 years, hiding the theft through creative accounting. Meanwhile, David had been using the family name to secure loans for increasingly risky real estate ventures, putting the entire family legacy at risk. I don't want to destroy them publicly, Dad had told me, but I can't let them destroy what I've built either. That's when he'd proposed the sale. Not to strangers, but to me, the daughter who'd quietly built a $3.2 billion investment empire while my brothers assumed I was struggling to make ends meet as a freelance consultant. Mr. Morrison, David said, his voice tight, who bought Dad's assets? Mr. Morrison looked directly at me. Phoenix Capital Holdings, represented by its CEO, Emma Thompson. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus and David turned to stare at me like I'd suddenly sprouted wings. That's impossible, Marcus whispered. Emma doesn't have that kind of money. Actually, I said, speaking for the first time since we'd sat down, I do. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder. Phoenix Capital Holdings is a subsidiary of my investment firm Horizon Enterprises. We manage approximately $3.2 billion in assets across technology, real estate, and manufacturing sectors. David's face had gone pale. You're lying. I slid a document across the table. This is the purchase agreement for Thompson Industries. Signed 3 years ago. Purchase price, $1.2 million. Marcus grabbed the paper, scanning it frantically. This says Phoenix Capital Holdings purchased the company assets, not the company itself. Correct, I said calmly. I bought the machinery, inventory, client contracts, and intellectual property. The empty shell of Thompson Industries was left for Dad to maintain operational control until his death. I slid another document forward. This is the purchase agreement for the family home. Purchase price, $450,000. And this, I continued, placing a third document on the table, is the purchase agreement for the lake house and surrounding 40 acres. Purchase price, $350,000. David was now openly sweating. Why would Dad sell to you and not tell us? Because, I said quietly, he discovered that Marcus had been stealing from the company, and David had been using fraudulent loan applications with the family assets as collateral. Marcus shot to his feet. That's a lie. I pulled out another folder. This contains copies of the altered financial statements you submitted to avoid tax obligations, Marcus. And documentation of the $200,000 you've taken from company accounts over the past 3 years. You can't prove that, he said, but his voice was shaking. I can actually. Dad installed new accounting software 6 months before he got sick. It tracked every transaction, every login, every modification to financial records. I turned to David. And these are copies of the loan applications you submitted using properties you didn't own as collateral. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division would be very interested in these documents. David slumped back in his chair. Emma, please. I was just trying to keep the business afloat. By lying to banks about assets worth over $1 million? Mr. Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue with the will reading? I nodded. Please. The will of Robert James Thompson, Mr. Morrison began, is quite straightforward given the recent asset transfers. To his son Marcus Thompson, he leaves his personal effects and the sum of $25,000, contingent upon completion of financial restitution training. Marcus's mouth fell open. $25,000? That's it. To his son David Thompson, Mr. Morrison continued, he leaves his collection of books and the sum of $25,000, contingent upon completion of a business ethics certification program. David was staring at the table, his hands clenched into fists. To his daughter Emma Thompson, Mr. Morrison read, he leaves his gratitude for saving the family legacy and his confidence that she will use the assets she now owns to honor the Thompson name in ways her brothers never could. The room was silent except for David's shaky breathing. There's more, Mr. Morrison said. Mr. Thompson included a letter to be read aloud. He opened an envelope with Dad's familiar handwriting. To my sons Marcus and David, by the time you hear this, you will have learned that Emma now owns everything I built. This was not a decision I made lightly, but it was necessary to protect our family's future from your poor choices. Marcus was shaking his head in disbelief. Marcus, your embezzlement cost the company nearly $200,000 and could have resulted in criminal charges. David, your fraudulent loan applications put our entire family at legal and financial risk. The letter continued. Emma spent her 20s building one of the most successful investment firms in the region while you both assumed she was failing. She never asked for help, never demanded attention, never sought credit for her achievements. When I needed someone to trust with our family legacy, the choice was obvious. Mr. Morrison looked up. The letter concludes, I hope you will use this as an opportunity to learn humility and rebuild your relationship with your sister, who has shown more wisdom and integrity than either of you have demonstrated in years. Marcus finally exploded. This is insane. Emma, you can't just steal our inheritance. I didn't steal anything, I said calmly. I purchased assets that Dad needed to sell to protect them from your embezzlement and David's fraud. We'll contest this, David said desperately. We'll get lawyers. I smiled sadly. David, I own a $3.2 billion company. I have an entire legal department. And more importantly, everything I did was completely legal and properly documented. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked parking lot where my brother's luxury cars sat next to my practical sedan. But here's what's going to happen, I continued, turning back to face them. Thompson Industries will continue operating but under new management. The employees who've worked there for decades won't lose their jobs because of your mistakes. What about us? Marcus asked quietly. You both have choices to make, I said. Marcus, you can complete the financial restitution program Dad specified, pay back what you stole, and apply for an entry-level position at Thompson Industries. You'll start at the bottom and work your way up based on merit, not family connections. Marcus looked like he might be sick. David, you can complete the business ethics program, and I'll consider bringing Thompson Development Group under the Horizon Enterprises umbrella as a subsidiary. But you'll be a junior partner with strict oversight until you prove you can operate ethically. And if we refuse? David asked. Then you take your $25,000 and find your own way, I said simply. But I won't prosecute for the embezzlement or fraud, provided you both stay away from any business involving the Thompson name. The meeting ended with my brothers sitting in stunned silence while Mr. Morrison gathered his papers. As we prepared to leave, Marcus approached me. Emma, he said quietly, I need to ask you something. What? The money Mom needed for her medical treatments last year. The experimental therapy that insurance wouldn't cover. I didn't answer, which was answer enough. That was you, wasn't it? The anonymous donor who covered everything. I picked up my briefcase. Mom's health was more important than anything else. But we thought Dad was paying for it. He said he had special insurance. Dad was protecting her from worrying about money while she fought cancer, I said. Just like he protected the business from your choices. David joined us. Emma, why didn't you ever tell us? About your company, your success. I looked at my brothers, Marcus in his $1,000 suit, David with his expensive watch, both of them having spent years treating me like the family disappointment. Because you never asked, I said simply. You saw what you expected to see. The quiet little sister who didn't drive a flashy car or live in a mansion. You assumed struggle instead of recognizing strategy. Strategy? Marcus asked. I built my company by living below my means, investing wisely and focusing on substance over appearances. While you both were buying expensive toys and impressive offices, I was acquiring assets and building relationships. I walked toward the door, then turned back. Dad saw that. He understood that real wealth isn't about what you spend, it's about what you build. 3 weeks later, I sat in Dad's old office at Thompson Industries, reviewing quarterly reports. The company was thriving under professional management, employee morale was up, and we just landed our biggest contract in 5 years. Marcus had enrolled in the financial restitution program and was working in the company's accounting department under strict supervision. He drove a used car now and lived in a modest apartment, but for the first time in years he seemed genuinely focused on honest work. David had been slower to accept reality, but after his wife threatened to leave him when she learned about the fraudulent loans, he'd finally enrolled in the ethics certification program. Thompson Development Group was now a subsidiary of Horizon Enterprises, focusing on affordable housing projects instead of luxury developments. Both of my brothers were required to attend weekly family dinners with Mom, where we slowly rebuilt relationships that had been damaged by years of assumptions and poor choices. You know, Mom said one Sunday, your father would be proud of how you've handled all this. We were sitting on the porch of the family home, the house I now owned but where Mom continued to live rent-free for as long as she wanted. I hope so, I said. He always said you were the smartest of his children, she continued. Even when you were little, you thought 3 moves ahead of everyone else. I just learned to be patient, I said. To build quietly and let results speak louder than announcements. Mom smiled. That's exactly what he said you'd do with the company. Emma will make it bigger and better than I ever imagined, but she'll do it so carefully that no one will notice until it's already done. 6 months after the will reading, Thompson Industries had expanded into 3 new markets and increased revenue by 40%. The original employees had received bonuses for the first time in years, and we'd established a scholarship fund for their children. Marcus approached me one afternoon as I was leaving the office. Emma, he said, I wanted to thank you. For what? For not destroying me. You could have had me arrested, could have ruined my reputation completely. Instead, you gave me a chance to earn my way back. I looked at my older brother who'd lost weight and gained humility over the past 6 months. Everyone deserves a second chance, Marcus. But only if they're willing to do the work to earn it. I am, he said. I'm learning more about business in this entry-level position than I learned in 10 years of being handed everything. David joined us, still wearing a suit but a much more modest one than his previous wardrobe. Emma, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything, David. Yes, I do. We spent years thinking you were the failure in the family. We never bothered to ask about your life, your work, your goals. We just assumed. You assumed what you wanted to assume, I said. It was easier than acknowledging that your little sister might be more successful than you were. A lot more successful, Marcus added with a rueful smile. I looked at both of my brothers, thinking about the conversation Dad and I had had 3 years earlier in his study. Your brothers aren't bad people, he'd said. They're just lost. They've had everything handed to them for so long that they've forgotten how to work for something. Do you think they can learn? I'd asked. With the right teacher, he'd said, smiling at me. Someone patient enough to let them fail and wise enough to help them rebuild. Standing in the parking lot of Thompson Industries, watching Marcus get into his used Honda and David climb into his practical sedan, I thought Dad had been right. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone isn't money or property or inheritance. Sometimes it's the opportunity to discover who they really are when everything else is stripped away. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the will reading 6 months earlier, about the shock on my brothers' faces when they learned the truth, about the long journey we'd all taken to get to this point. Dad had entrusted me with more than just his company and properties. He'd entrusted me with his sons' futures, with the responsibility of teaching them lessons he'd been too gentle to enforce himself. It hadn't been easy. There had been arguments and resentment and moments when I wondered if I should have just let them learn the hard way. But seeing Marcus find pride in honest work and David discover the satisfaction of ethical business practices made every difficult conversation worth it. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Sunday dinner at 6. Marcus is cooking. David is bringing dessert. You're bringing yourself. No excuses. I smiled. Some things were more valuable than money or property or even justice. Family was worth rebuilding even when it meant starting from scratch. Especially when it meant starting from scratch.